Boldwood presents Family Affairs at Orchard Cottage Hospital, written by Lizzie Lane and read by Anne Dover. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. All Saints Workhouse, Whitechapel, March 1931. The women's quarters are in the East Wing and men in the West Wing. Depending on their ages, children are quartered separately for lessons and in the dormitories when asleep. They're allowed 1 hour in the morning with their parents and half an hour in the evening before bedtime. What about the married quarters? Where might that be? Mrs. Tuffington, the workhouse matron, drew in her hairy chin as a duck might just before emitting a loud quack. As in any other such establishment, men and women are confined to separate quarters, regardless of whether they're married or not. Consider what would happen if it were not so, exclaimed Mrs. Tuffington, with a laugh that sounded as if it were caused by a tickle in her throat. More babies would likely be born should we allow conjugal arrangements. And then where would we be? Overpopulated with even more of the dissolute and parish poor, Mrs. Devonshire, that's what. I see your point. A few weeks ago she'd asked if she could have a copy of a certain birth certificate. The answer had been a terse no. Such information is confined to staff only. Many babies were adopted and the adoptive parents have the right to privacy. What about the babies and the mothers who bore them? Girls who fall into wicked ways have no rights. That's what she'd been told. It was sheer luck that she'd heard about their need for someone to work as a member of staff, an opportunity she'd jumped at. Right. Mrs. Tuffington heaved a sigh that seemed to proclaim satisfaction that the woman she'd employed to assist with workhouse admin and other duties, as yet to be confirmed, understood the rules. Now, she said, her shoulders as angular as a set square. Let us proceed. With the opening of a door came the sound of a crying baby. So too did a milky, sour smell and a hint of ammonia. On entering the room, she espied the source of the ammonia in a bucket containing soiled nappies. 4 small babies under 6 months old are looked after here. 8 toddlers up to 4 years old in the next room. It will be your job, yours and Miss Sims, to feed, bathe and change them. Miss Sims? A whey-faced young woman of about 17 years old looked up from laying a swaddled baby alongside 2 others in a shared cot. Mrs. Tuffington indicated the new employee. This is Mrs. Devonshire. The cowed-looking young woman gave a quick nod. Mrs. Devonshire will be assisting you with general duties when needed and taking care of record-keeping. She will do all the writing that needs to be done. Miss Sims swiped the back of her hand across her runny nose. I don't need no help. Of course you do, Jane Sims, and don't you be so cheeky. Hand in front of her mouth, Mrs. Tuffington whispered, She can neither read nor write. Been here all her life. Gave up her baby, and there'd been nothing for her in the outside world. The new employee, Mrs. Devonshire, made no comment, but her heart bled for the poor girl. How had she felt about giving up her baby? She forced herself to bury her true feelings. I have to say that I much appreciate you taking me on. Mrs. Tuffington sniffed dismissively. It's the least I could do. The war made far too many widows, and I can't think how difficult it must be to manage on just a war pension. And anyway, your grasp of words and figures will be of great advantage. On the outside, Mary Devonshire smiled humbly and muttered how very pleased she was to be here. Inside, she was doubly so. So impressed had Mrs. Tuffington been with her figures, words, and general aptitude that she'd taken her on without further ado. She hadn't even checked her credentials or asked for references, for which Mary was doubly grateful. All Mrs. Tuffington saw before her was yet another woman in her 50s and left destitute by the carnage of the Great War. Better still, she could take over the general administration of the workhouse, besides assisting the truculent Jane Sims with the babies and toddlers. "I'm so pleased you applied for the position," Mrs. Tuffington said. "I must admit to being a little nervous, being of the age I am." "Nonsense! You've a few years yet before retirement. To my mind, older people are far more reliable employees than younger ones. Such as her there," said Mrs. Tuffington, dropping her voice, whilst her eyes travelled in the direction of Jane Sims. "I do believe you will do us proud, and we will have a long and worthy working relationship." "I'm sure we will," returned Mary Devonshire, which was an outright lie. For a while, this place would serve as a refuge from the outside world, whilst she investigated a subject that was closer to her heart. Henry Devonshire, a man she had married in haste, and certainly repented at leisure, was dead and buried on the other side of the world in Australia, a country she'd been obliged to live in whether she'd liked it or not. The man responsible for her exile was no doubt long dead by now, but Henry was not. Thankfully, there were thousands of miles between them. After a tour of the sad little world of destitute people with nowhere else to go, Mrs. Tuffington took Mary Devonshire down into the cellar, where the archives of years gone by were stored in canvas folders. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight that greeted her. "You won't often need to come down here. Now and again we are asked for past accounts by the border guardians, and when you need to archive the records of those who are no longer with us, those whose fortunes have improved, and the others, those who have left us and entered heavenly portals." Mrs. Devonshire eyed the shelves containing the records of past years and past inmates of the establishment. Each year was clearly identified. So were the manner of the records. Her jaw clenched when she saw the section labelled Births. She commented that the records went back a long way. "Yes, those at the end of the oldest archives, hence the papers curling around the edges. I'm sure a mature woman like you will have no trouble filing and finding the things you need," trilled Mrs. Tuffington, flicking her fingers over dusty files lined up in crumpled rows along the shelves. "I'm sure I'll cope very well indeed." "Just one thing." Mrs. Tuffington adopted a serious expression. "At no time do you give out details of babies born here who were subsequently adopted. So, to anyone who comes asking for birth certificates, etc., the answer is always no. Is that clear, Mrs. Devonshire?" "Yes." Mrs. Tuffington beamed with pleasure. "I'm sure you'll settle in no time at all." No time at all. The words rang inside Mary Devonshire's head. Time, some said, was a great healer, but it wasn't for her. She still hurt from what had happened all those years ago, when she'd been brutally separated from her child and forced to travel to the other side of the world. It might have made a difference if she'd been blessed with more children, but she hadn't. No children, and an unhappy marriage to a violent man who'd almost killed her had caused her to consider what she wanted from life. There was only one answer. She had to go back. She had to find the child who'd been taken from her. Getting this job was the first step in her quest. Whether she would be successful or not was neither here nor there. She was back in the country of her birth, and somewhere, as yet she did not know where, there was a child who had grown into womanhood. Somehow she would find her daughter. Chapter 2. Norton Dene, Somerset. March 1931. Dr. Frances Brakespeare was sitting at her desk in her office at the Orchard Cottage Hospital in the Somerset town of Norton Dene, a country town the land around it scarred with coal mines and quarries. She was writing new copy for the leaflets that would advertise the women's clinic, wondering if she was brave enough to mention advice on family planning. She'd seen so many women back in London and here in the town of Norton Dene, their health impaired by too many pregnancies. Many of those women struggled to feed families of 4, 6 or more children. And yet, who could deny them their natural urges, for some, the only pleasure they had in life? Susan, who looked after record-keeping, reception and typing letters, knocked at the door and, without waiting for her to answer, brought in the most beautiful bouquet. "You have an admirer?" she said in her usual jovial fashion. "I know I do," said Frances, putting down her pen and taking the bunch of flowers in her arms, consisting of spring flowers, daffodils, tulips, and fluffy, frothy stuff that she didn't quite recognize. The handwriting was a different matter. She smiled as she read the words that broke her concentration and brought a smile to her face. "Dr. Brakespeare, these flowers are by way of a reminder that you have been resident doctor at Orchard Cottage Hospital for a whole year. Congratulations. You've stayed the course, and I, for one, am very glad that you have. Love, both heavenly and otherwise, from the Reverend Gregory Sampson, vicar of this parish, and your greatest admirer." His message brought a smile to her face. Her time working at a large London hospital seemed a lifetime ago. She'd thought at one stage that it was the place she'd always wanted to be, but had been fired because she'd dared to speak up for herself to a male colleague. As fate would have it, Izzy Brakespeare, her beloved benefactress, who had taken her from the workhouse and brought her up, had died around the same time. Greater dismay followed when she'd received a letter from solicitors representing Mrs. Beatrice Trinder, Izzy's sister, to vacate the premises forthwith. As a result, she'd ended up jobless and homeless. Fate had further lent a hand when her attention had been drawn to a position at the Orchard Cottage Hospital in the Norton Dene. Wheels within wheels in the form of Izzy's old suffragette friends had worked behind the scenes to land her the position. One of them was Lady Araminta Compton-Dixon, more informally called Minty, and a Deborah, one of Izzy's friends from London. From the moment Frances had arrived from London, the Reverend Gregory Sampson had been her staunchest ally and friend. He'd also asked her to marry him, though pressure of work had prevented them setting a serious date. "We'll get around to it," she'd said to him, "but first I need to make my mark at the hospital." He'd responded that she'd made her mark with him, but that he was prepared to wait. She'd thrown herself into being resident doctor at the Orchard Cottage Hospital. Some people in town had balked at the prospect of a female doctor. Others thought her a breath of fresh air. She'd made changes. She'd modernized. And she intended carrying on doing so. She'd set up the mother and baby clinic shortly after she'd first arrived. Now she had plans to take it a bit further, which were both modern and bound to shock in such a traditional small town. Family planning advice was likely to be contentious, but something about the flowers arriving and Gregory's message had suddenly lifted her confidence. She'd discussed it with Gregory the night before over a very fine dinner and a glass of wine fermented from elderflower. "Family planning? My goodness, Frances, you're certainly going to set the cat among the pigeons. I'm not sure this town is ready for the ideas of Marie Stopes." Frances had thrust her chin forward in the determined manner that Gregory was getting used to. Loved, in fact. "Women need more information on what they can do to prevent pregnancy, if that is their wish, and I intend giving them that information. Marie Stopes has opened a clinic in London and is particularly keen to help the poor escape the grinding poverty that comes with having too many children. I understand that. But can't you be just a little more subtle?" Perhaps it was his tone of voice, or perhaps the comforting way he was kneading her shoulders, but her feisty determination became less vibrant. "And tell people to control their natural urges? or to practice methods a Catholic priest would insist on. Odd, seeing as they've vowed celibacy. Right. You've got the mother and baby clinic up and running, and the town's got used to that. But family planning, I'm not sure some here are ready for it. Especially the church. The church per se might, but opinion varies from bishop to bishop and vicar to vicar. He'd grinned. You know my stance. I agree with what you're trying to do. I'm just saying tread carefully. Take it slowly. It had been his idea to have leaflets printed for circulation at the clinic rather than paste big notices outside the town hall, the hospital, and the post office. Keep the mother and baby clinic posters up and give out the new leaflets about family planning to the mothers who attend. Doesn't that make more sense? Nobody getting upset. She'd admitted that he was right. I wouldn't want to cause a riot. Absolutely. She'd smiled at the thought of his method of persuasion, surprised that the calming power of his massage had made her change her mind. Massage, she'd said, with a sigh of satisfaction, could well become a healing force to be considered for the future. Last night had ended on a high note, a kiss beneath a sky of stars, and a deep sleep that had lasted until the dawn chorus began out in the garden. Turning her attention back to the copy for the leaflets, Frances wrote and rewrote the valuable information she thought would benefit the women of Norton Dene. Norton Dene, are you ready for this? She muttered to herself. This town was such a different place to where she'd grown up, and settling in had been something of an ordeal. She'd steeled herself to fit in, even though the town was so different to London and the life she'd lived there. London had seemed the heart of her world, both the hospital where she'd trained and hoped for advancement, plus the excitement of living under the roof of a highly intelligent and unwed woman who had held amazing parties attended by clever women who discussed politics, social conditions, and international responsibility on the part of the most widespread empire the world had ever known. She'd enjoyed those years. The colour, the energy, and the love of a confirmed spinster for an abandoned child. Had she ever wanted to know the identity of her natural mother? The question had never seemed that important. She had Isabel, who she'd both admired and loved. A confirmed spinster and suffragette, Izzy, whose full name was Isabel Frances Brakespeare, had rescued her from likely destitution and made a concerted effort to encourage her to become whatever she wanted to be. This is only a man's world if women allow it. It had been one of her favourite sayings. Frances could see her in her mind's eye, pacing up and down the drawing room, her clothes businesslike, almost bordering on masculine, the smoke from a French or Turkish cigarette trailing from between her fingers, a black silk bow tied at the throat over a crispy white shirt. Her strident voice still rang like a bell in Frances's head. Just because you're a woman doesn't mean you have to be a wife and mother. This is the 20th century. You can be anything you want. There were hints in some of the things that Izzy said, some second-hand titbits from her friends. One of them had suggested that Izzy was a female Professor Higgins, and Frances, her protégée, had been groomed to fulfill Izzy's ambition to be a doctor. The person who dared to suggest such a thing was never invited to the house again. Yet the idea persisted that Izzy had wanted to break the shackles of female serfdom that had inhibited her life and blaze a trail in the medical world. For some reason that was never explained, this did not happen. Whatever the truth was, Frances had adored her and tried to be everything Izzy had wanted her to be. She could remember saying, "I'm your little girl, and I swear I'll make you proud of me." Something about that comment had made Izzy take a deep intake of breath. Frances had been young at the time, but still she had perceived a sudden draining of Izzy's sizzling energy, coupled with a haunted look in her eyes. And then it was as though she'd woken up from a deep sleep, jerked back from her inner world to the everyday normality of familiar surroundings, The haunted look was vanquished with sudden laughter, a merry quip, and flighty movements from chair to piano to books and conversation, confined strictly to the moment. The mask of a woman who radiated confidence and tough independence was pulled back in place. "I knew when I picked you from all the others that you would make me proud." Her explanation had been flippant and somewhat dismissive, which led Frances to believe that she hadn't been telling the truth, that there was some other reason. But then she'd been a child. She could have been wrong, and besides, her curiosity was for simpler things. "Was it sunny that day?" Frances had asked. "Did I cry when you brought me home?" "I don't remember," Izzy had returned somewhat curtly. "Was it a very long time ago?" "Too long to worry about." Frances had remembered feeling disconsolate. She'd so wanted to not just know the details of her past, but to feel it. Izzy had noticed the sudden silence, the dropping of her trembling chin. "Sweetheart," she'd said softly, her fingers combing through Frances's hair. "The past is a foreign place, water under the bridge, never to be revisited. No regrets." Yet Frances had sensed there were regrets, ones that for whatever reason Izzy refused to utter, at least not to Frances. There was one more question Frances had dared to ask. "Do I have a daddy?" Izzy's face had turned white, and the haunted look had turned black, so it seemed that her pupils filled her eye sockets. The question remained unanswered. Izzy had changed the subject. Frances couldn't recall as to what, just a jarring U-turn. Even now, after all these years, Izzy had the capacity to crowd her thoughts. Sometimes it was little things that barged into her mind and became big ones. She had thought to ask whether Izzy had a father, but her adoptive mother tended to fend off any questions regarding her family. In all the years they'd been together, the Brakespeare family had never visited. Neither, as far as Frances knew, had Izzy visited them. Even 2 or 3 years ago, when a letter had arrived informing her of her father's death, Izzy had held firm. When Frances had asked if there was any particular reason she didn't want to pay her respects, the answer came sharp and quick, the tone brittle and bitter. "He doesn't deserve respect, certainly not from me." Her eyes had glittered like cold diamonds, and in that unique moment she seemed to shut the world out, to withdraw into herself. It felt to Frances that she was licking wounds, although she had no idea what those wounds might be, only that they appeared to run deep, deep enough to breed hatred of monumental proportions. It came as a great shock when Izzy died. The whole world seemed to crumble around her. Worse still, her death had come at the same time as Frances had upset a senior doctor at the hospital and been dismissed. Nowhere to live, and no job. It seemed that tribulation piled on tribulation, and Izzy's sister, Beatrice Trinder, was not helping matters. This business about evicting her from the house she'd grown up in was downright vindictive. But why? Frances couldn't help but feel as though the woman wanted to make her life as difficult as possible, and for no real reason. All she could think was that when alive, Izzy had slighted her in some way. No matter how deeply she thought about it, her fine eyebrows slanting over her deep-set grey eyes, there was no valid reason why Beatrice Trinder should hate her so much. Whatever the reason, the woman gave no quarter. She'd even tried to snatch the little car Izzy had given Frances when she'd passed her finals. The little car was imperative to a doctor moving to the country, and Beatrice herself could have no use for it. But that was the way it was. Izzy's sister seemed dead set on making Frances's life as difficult as possible. Although a dismaying occurrence at first, losing job and home turned from a tragedy into a triumph. It seemed by chance that the opportunity at the Orchard Cottage Hospital in Norton Dene had beckoned her to apply, although latterly she had a sneaking suspicion that friends of Izzy might have had a hand in it. especially Lady Araminta Compton-Dixon, Lady of the Manor and driving force on the committee of the cottage hospital. Izzy, her ladyship and several of their friends had been members of the Women's Social and Political Union, commonly called the Suffragettes. Younger then, but feisty, the brave souls who had fought so fiercely for women's rights in the past were still a sisterhood, the ties born in a time of struggle as strong as ever. Friendships made in youth had become friendships for life. Detaching herself from her thoughts, Frances concentrated once again on perfecting the copy for the leaflets on family planning. Reluctant at first, she had to accept that Gregory was probably right about not plastering posters in prominent places. Give the good people of Norton Dene time to adjust. The world was changing, and the attitudes of the past were being slowly but determinedly overridden. The present title of the leaflet sprang out at her. Family Planning. Her lips moved soundlessly as she read it through. She asked herself whether it was pitched at the right level. Was it attention-grabbing? Would it attract the outrage of those of a more narrow-minded disposition, such as the church and various women's groups? Holding the end of the pen between her teeth, she reread the heading. Family Planning. She said it out loud before deciding it didn't really say enough. Tipping her head back, she closed her eyes and thought through a few options. Modern contraception. Birth control. A woman's place. Planning for children. A woman's world? She let the pen drop from her hand. It was hard to decide which of these titles, if any, would shout what was on offer to those desperately in need of limiting their families whilst not upsetting the more conservative residents of the town. So much was good about Norton Dene and her new life, but there were still prejudices that must be overcome, the clinging to the past, replaced by the new ideas that would take them into the future. To many people, the idea of controlling the number of children they had was alien, something else they could dislike about the modern age. There would be no point telling them that Mrs. Annie Besant, a member of the Malthusian movement of the late 19th century, was one of the leaders of the birth control movement. Along with Charles Bradlaugh, Annie Besant published a physiological treatise in 1876 entitled Fruits of Philosophy. Some other great reformers of that time were also firm supporters of birth control, a means by which the health of the nation could be improved. The health of the British Empire depended on healthy people to maintain its credibility. Mary Stopes and her husband, Humphrey Roe, had opened the first birth control clinic in Holloway, London, in 1921. Frances felt in awe of this woman, but also it was a challenge to her own capabilities. Norton Dene wasn't London, but the problems of women struggling with large families was national, not local, and like this stalwart of the movement, she wanted to help the poor as well as those who could pay. Such a lot of thinking. For now, she needed a break before her brain burst. After filling a blue and white jug with water, she began arranging the sweet-smelling flowers, smiling at the thought of her first meeting with the Reverend Gregory Sampson. Hair as golden as a sun god, his expression had consistently wavered on a smile. It had struck her at the time as the look of a man who seemed constantly bemused with the world, a unique look in more ways than one. Never had she met a minister of any church without the slightest trace of dryness to his sermons, or a hint of gloom and doom on his face, or the threat of damnation in his words. But hellfire and brimstone were not Gregory's style. He exuded infectious joy in his job and everyday interaction with people and the world at large. In short, he had the capacity to make religion part of everyday life, not just for Sundays. Never had she envisaged herself as a vicar's wife. But the possibility was there, and although it was early days, the future looked promising, so long as she could continue to be a physician, that is. So far, no objection had been raised. Flowers arranged to her satisfaction, Frances gathered up the leaflets and placed them in the top drawer of her desk. Once everything was tidied away, she reached for her stethoscope. Next stop, the children's ward. Then the women's ward. Then the men. Outside her office, she turned to the staccato sound of stout shoes to see Sister Edith Harrison bearing down on her. The ward sister came level before glancing tellingly down at the fob watch hanging on her breast. "I was wondering where you'd got to, Doctor," she said, letting the watch drop back onto her chest. "Goodness, is that the time already?" Frances said it with innocent aplomb after taking a cursory look at her wristwatch. 10 minutes past? What would I do without you to keep me on my toes?" She said it cheerfully, whilst hiding the mirth in her eyes by marching on ahead, her face firmly forward. Sister Harrison was more than a trifle overbearing, but in Frances's opinion, it was better to feed her self-importance and make her feel valued. Being convivial and eschewing a little praise helped maintain hospital efficiency and professional interaction. The staff worked as a team. It didn't do to let personalities get in the way. They stopped at the small alcove at the entrance to the children's ward. It was routine for the ward sister to run through the cases needing attention that day. "We have a new patient who I think you should see first." She passed Frances the record card for the new patient. "This card looks incomplete," she said, flicking it over onto the reverse side just to make sure she hadn't missed details such as name and address. Sister Harrison marched on, a picture of starched uniform and clipped efficiency. "It's all we have." Of the 3 boys in the children's ward, 2 were getting over scarlet fever. These 2 would be allowed home soon. Along with Sister Harrison, her face devoid of expression and as stiff as her apron, they attended the boy admitted only that morning, who lay alone behind a drawn screen. The smell of carbolic mixed with that of pungent filth. Frances wrinkled her nose, which Sister Harrison noticed and commented on. "He's been given a wash. Once he's well enough, I'll have him bathed, but as you can see, he's currently in no state to be interfered with too much. I've had his clothes incinerated. They were infested. Judging by the state of him, he needs complete rest." If it hadn't been for the purple and yellow bruising on his face, the boy's pallor would have matched that of the starched pillow. One eye was half closed, and his cheeks were sunken. His body was wraith-like beneath the bedclothes, his arms patterned with bruises and burns. Bile rose from her stomach. She'd seen beaten young boys before back in London. "He's not given a name or address?" "No, we've asked, but he won't answer." "Did he come here alone?" "Someone found him and brought him in." "Well, we can't have that, can we?" Frances smiled down at the tousle-haired boy. "I didn't catch your name. Can you tell me what it is?" He blinked, just the once, as though surprised to see her there. After that he turned away, staring blankly at a spot in the screen not quite covered by the green material. Sister Harrison had found him some clean and rather washed-out pyjamas from the store they kept for those who didn't own any nightclothes. After a brief scrutiny of his wounds, Frances tried again. "You look as though you've been in the wars." A nerve flickered beneath one eye, where a yellow frill encircled a purple bruise. There were bruises down the side of his face, a particularly large one sitting like a Victoria plum on his cheekbone. Frances composed herself. This wasn't the first child she'd suspected the subject of severe and prolonged beatings. London was full of them. So, too, it seemed, was Norton Dene. She took a deep breath before addressing Sister Harrison. "Let's take a look at his chest, shall we?" Sister Harrison's adept fingers rolled up the lad's pyjama top into thin folds as high as his collarbone. Frances took shallow breaths as she placed the stethoscope in various places over the lad's prominent ribs, which, like his face, was liberally dotted with bruises. Doctor and nurse exchanged knowing looks over the boy's undernourished body. "Right," said Frances with soft reassurance. "We're going to turn you over so I can hear what's going on in your lungs. Sister Harrison?" One on one side and one the other, they gently turned the boy onto his belly. He did not protest and stayed silent. They rolled up his pajama top again to the level of his shoulder blades. Frances swallowed the sharp intake of breath that threatened and exchanged a tight, outraged look with Sister Harrison. There were wheals across the boy's back. Some were relatively new. Others were a mixture of yellow and violet, a sure sign that they were older. Even once he was lying on his back again, he made not a murmur. Neither did he look at them, but kept his eyes partially closed. It was, thought Frances, as though he was falling inwards with nothing for company except his thoughts, which were likely as bruised as his body. Taking a fountain pen from her breast pocket, she entered her diagnosis on the record card. Unknown boy. In my estimation, possibly 9 or 10 years old. Multiple contusions, cuts, and grazes. Evidence of broken ribs. Malnourished. Partially healed and fresh wheals across his back. Possibly the result of being beaten with a whip or cane. Feeling sick to her soul, and so wanting to cuddle him and tell him all would be well, Frances leaned over him. Don't you worry, young man. You're in hospital. Nobody's going to hurt you. I won't let them. Neither would Sister Harrison. Would you like some food? He didn't answer. She turned to Sister Harrison. Get some brought to him anyway, she said softly. Yes, Doctor. Do we know who brought him in? Whispered Frances. Mr. Locke from the Goose and Gander Inn. He found him curled up behind the beer barrels. Did he give a name for the boy? Sister Harrison shook her head. No. Left him here and shot off like a hare fleeing the hounds. Her tone was disapproving. Frances frowned. Let's ask him again, shall we? I doubt he'll tell us. We'll try, anyway. She leaned closer to the expressionless face, noted the tangled, unwashed hair. We don't know your name. Would you like to tell us what it is? The same question received the same answer. That is, total silence, plus an unwillingness to turn his head and look at them. Frances sighed. Well, let's get him cleaned up and comfortable, shall we? Yes, Dr. Brakespeare. Sister Harrison had shown a caring side to her nature, which made Frances think she was breaking through to a softer centre. You can call me Dr. Frances, Sister Harrison. Everyone else does. The middle-aged nursing sister held her head aloft and sniffed. I'm not everyone else. Being snubbed like that left Frances speechless, but reminded her that it took all sorts to make a world, including Sister Harrison, who had old-fashioned attitudes, at least in her professional life. In private, if rumour and what she knew herself was anything to go by, she had male friends. Simon Granger, son of the lessee of the Orchard Quarry, had been one of those she'd dallied with. He'd since left town and was living in the village of Monkswell, overseeing the quarry he'd tried to get Ned Skittings transferred to. Ned Skittings was married to Nancy, sister of Lucy Daniels, both nurses. Following an accident at the quarry, when Ned was badly injured, even before he was healed, Simon Granger had contrived to have Ned take a job at Monkswell Quarry in the Forest of Dene on the other side of the River Severn. It came to light that Simon had been negligent and caused the accident, and Ned was witness to it. When this was found out, it was Simon who ended up in the quarry. It wasn't beyond belief that Sister Harrison was missing him, and, in a way, who could blame her? She lived alone with her mother, and that was a good enough reason to enjoy a little social life on her own account. After completing her round of the men's and women's wards, Frances's thoughts went back to the boy, his injuries, and where he might belong. Who knew? It was possible that a family was missing him, though not much of a family if his injuries were anything to go by. Perhaps Lucy, Nurse Daniels, might know who he is, Frances suggested. She'll be in shortly. I'll ask her then. But I don't hold out much hope, returned Sister Harrison through tight lips.
Everyone knows everyone else in this town. If none of us knows him, then I'm afraid that's the way it'll stay."
"Not a gypsy child, perhaps?"
"No. The gypsies haven't been around here for years, and when they do, it's in one of the surrounding villages, not in town." They came to a stop at the end of the sleeping boy's bed.
"Unless he wandered or ran away."
They'd spoken softly, and the boy gave no sign of having heard them.
"Has he eaten?"
"Some soup."
"Good."
"And with Nurse Daniel's help, he'll be having a bath tomorrow."
"Gently," said Frances. "Go gently with him."
"Of course."
"I want to find out who did this. I'll phone the police."
"They won't do anything."
"I think they should be informed. You never know." At the end of the day, her office still smelled of flowers, and their colour brightened the room. For a moment it felt as though time had rewound itself, and Frances was seeing the flowers and reading the card all over again. But hours had passed since they'd arrived, and tending to patients and writing medical notes had taken over. The identity of the young boy who had endured several beatings over a period of time was uppermost in her mind. A phone call to the town police station had proved fruitless. They'd had no reports of a missing child, but did promise to send someone along to look at the boy and take notes. Her next thought was that Gregory might know the child. It was a long shot, but worth asking anyway. The phone at the vicarage rang 4 times before he picked it up, his rich baritone reverberating down the line.
"The Reverend Gregory Sampson here, St. Michael's Vicarage. How can I help you?"
"Gregory, it's me."
"Whilst on duty at the hospital? Goodness, I am flattered that you've taken time out to phone me."
"Don't be facetious. I have something very important to ask you, though first I should thank you for the flowers." She fingered one flower of pale blue. "I love the smell of spring flowers. They're very calming. And at the present time, I'm in great need of calming."
"That's why I chose them. Beats the smell of lavender furniture polish every time, though my housekeeper, Mrs. Cross, wouldn't agree. I think she'd wear furniture polish as perfume if she could."
Frances laughed loudly at the very thought of Mrs. Cross dabbing lavender furniture polish behind each ear. "You're lucky to have her. The vicarage wouldn't be half as spick and span without her."
"Only teasing."
"I know you are. Thank you again. They really are lovely."
"I'm glad you like them."
His voice softened into gentleness as well as affection.
"I was going to cook for you tonight."
She laughed. "You're always cooking for me. I must have put on 8 pounds since I moved here."
"You're a picture of health. The bloom of the countryside is on your skin."
His words of affection were flavoured with amusement. "I'm going to say no to your kind invitation, or at least partially."
"Now that is confusing. Are you accepting or not? Or are you going to eat half and take the other half of the meal home?"
His jokiness brought a smile to her face, and she imagined that he was smiling too. "I thought we might go to the pub."
"The Cross Hands!" He sounded greatly cheered. "I cannot refuse. Their cider is terrific."
She barely suppressed a chuckle before she informed him that they were not going to his favourite local. "I have other plans. I want to go to the Goose and Gander."
"Really?"
He sounded greatly surprised. "Have you been in there yourself, Gregory, for pleasure or the business of saving souls?"
"I've always tried not to. It's not the most salubrious establishment in town. Why do I get the feeling you have a specific reason for going there?"
"Because I do have a specific reason for going there. I don't have time to speak to you now, but perhaps later, when you're downing that 2nd pint of cider, or whatever."
"I will bend to your will and give in to temptation."
"I want to speak to the landlord there. He brought in a patient, a young boy, so thin and dirty. I'm surprised he's still alive. No name, no address. He's a mass of bruises and has been beaten. I want to find out who did this to him. If you don't wish to accompany me, I'll go by myself."
"No, you won't. I'll be your guardian angel."
Chapter 3.
London. Breakfast was finished at the Trinder house in Islington, and Arnold Trinder had given his wife a quick peck on the cheek before leaving for his job at the Stock Exchange in the heart of the City of London. Beatrice Trinder, who'd been born Beatrice Brakespeare, was similar in features to her late sister, though lacked Izzy's dynamic exuberance. Instead of a face shining with relentless energy and zest for life, Beatrice had a bitter twist to her narrow lips and a stiffly determined demeanour, as though she had constant battles to fight in a world that showed her little regard. She couldn't remember their mother, who had died when they were young, but she did remember and had worshipped her father. He'd been her entire world, and she'd so wanted to be his favourite, but that position was reserved for her sister Izzy. It was Izzy who'd received demonstrative affection. Izzy, the lively one who'd made his eyes shine with a love she'd so wanted him to show her, Beatrice. She'd done her best to win his love whilst he was alive, but it hadn't happened. Not really. But now, after his death, she would prove that she was the daughter who had loved him unconditionally, the one who would honour his name in any way she could. He might not be privy to her steadfast loyalty, but she would know, and she would be content. At least, that was what she told herself. A polite knock at the dining-room door preceded Annie, the parlour-maid, a silver tray in hand, on which lay the first mail delivery of the day. Beatrice searched through the small pile, placing those addressed to her husband to one side. Amongst them was one addressed to herself, one she'd been waiting for. This was a letter she wanted to read alone. "Thank you, Annie. You may go."
"Yes, ma'am."
The girl hesitated.
"Mrs. Trinder, I wonder—"
Her voice was hesitant, which immediately put Beatrice on her guard. Her brows beetled. Her eyes were glassy. "What is it you're wondering?" snapped Beatrice. Annie nervously knotted her hands behind her back and crossed the fingers of her right hand.
"There's a stale half a loaf in the pantry. I wondered if I might give it to the hurdy-gurdy man at the end of the road."
"No, you may not. Tell cook to make a bread and butter pudding from it. You know I abhor waste. The hurdy-gurdy man can buy his own."
"Yes, ma'am."
Eyes downcast, the maid left the room. Outside the door, unseen by her mistress, Annie poked out her tongue and muttered,
"Mean old bitch."
The maid wasn't wrong. Beatrice had a deeply covetous streak and was not inclined to be generous. The letter she'd received from the firm of solicitors who acted for her in all matters pertaining to her family would be testimony to that, or so she hoped, if they'd done their job right. Letter in hand, she headed for the study, where the air smelled of stale cigar smoke and gold-spined books glinted in the semi-gloom. After closing the door, she sat behind her husband's desk, picked up the brass letter opener, and sliced open the envelope. The paper was thick and stiff, and the letter was handwritten, which pleased her no end, because it meant they'd taken time, which in turn conveyed their respect for a woman of means, a woman of good family and commendable status. "Dear Mrs. Trinder, as per your instructions, we made inquiries as to the present whereabouts of Dr. Brakespeare, your late sister's adopted daughter." The term adopted daughter caused Beatrice's bottom lip to curl downwards, exposing her clenched teeth. Reference to adoption, allowing a workhouse waif into the family, grated. Addressing her as doctor, a qualification she regarded had been bought with Brakespeare money, set her teeth on edge. Taking a firm grip on her grinding teeth, she read on. "We can confirm that she is still in the town of Norton Dene, where she holds the position of resident doctor at the cottage hospital." The term cottage hospital immediately struck her as amusing, a contemptuous amusement like a cat hissing through sharp teeth. Cottage hospital. Like a poor man's hovel, but with more beds. If this upstart had been practicing her craft at a London hospital, she might have been impressed. Though possibly not. Nothing this person could do would either impress or soften her attitude. "Cottage," she laughed out loud, before her jaw tightened and she gritted her teeth and read on. This woman, This detritus from a workhouse and a common working girl had been educated at her sister's expense. The very thought of her gaining professional status was infuriating. Without the Brakespeare money and name, the girl would probably have become a domestic servant, a barmaid pulling pints, or a shabby little person working 12 hours a day in a factory. Or she could have become worse, a street urchin, a whore selling her body for her daily bread. That was what she should have been, and would have been, if it hadn't been for Isabel's overly generous disposition. A deep-seated resentment boiled within her, alongside a conviction that she was better than anyone else, a person of class and respectable to the core. Nobody could persuade her to be generous of spirit towards the urchin from the workhouse. People in the workhouse were of a feckless nature, which was why they'd ended up there in the first place. Never mind the heart-rending lamentations and cries for help. Beatrice had no time for any of that. In her opinion, they had only themselves to blame. The question of her sister's adoptive daughter smouldered inside. She was like a dog with a bone. She couldn't let go of it, couldn't stop it ruling her days and her nights. Her husband's kiss that morning had helped smooth over the argument they'd had the night before, when she'd declared that the workhouse child's mother must have been of low morals to have ended up giving birth there. Her husband had countered that she couldn't know the circumstances, and therefore should not condemn either the child or the natural mother out of hand. Beatrice had retaliated with angry indignation. "I don't care about the circumstances of the child's birth. She is not entitled to my family name." "You married me. You're no longer a Brakespeare. You're Mrs. Arnold Trinder." Livid and furious, she'd thrown a teacup at him and shouted that she'd been born Brakespeare. What she was now was of no consequence.